Thank you very much for joining us. Would you be so kind as to take us through your background, your work, talk about what you're published in to give context to uh, what we'll be discussing today?
Sure. Yeah, my name's Karl Widerquist. I'm a political philosopher, and I also have a background in economics. I've been working on distributive justice since the 20th century. I'm concerned about the ethics of who has what, and the power that that gives people in society. I've consider that there's a big power imbalance between between people in the country that's very much tied to the distribution of property and wealth. And so I've been arguing about the ethics of redistributing property and wealth in the form of a basic income, where everyone gets an unconditional payment from the state, no questions asked, no requirement to work or prove you need it or anything. It is, and this, I've argued, is necessary. It's necessary to protect the freedom of individuals who would otherwise have really no choice but to accept whatever jobs are available at whatever wages, at whatever working conditions are available. And that situation where some people have to get a job for other people is artificially created, where the government has taken the resource of the earth and said, this small group of people own all the resources. They can work if they want to, or they can just live off of their property if they want to, and the rest of us have to go to them to provide some sort of service for them in order to stay alive. You might work for another middle-class person, but you've got to go to banks, landlords, and big corporations to get everything that you need. You've got to find some way to benefit them, either directly or indirectly, in order to survive. And by doing that, we're putting the mass of humanity at an enormous disadvantage as they step out their door and into the labor market.
All right. So what got you into this area of study?
Well, growing up, I was always concerned with social justice. And when I heard about basic income or something quite like it, on my 15th birthday, it was actually from Milton, for all people, Milton Friedman's television show, Free to Choose. He had an episode about guaranteed income. And I said, aha, if you really want to help people, you stop telling them what to do. Give and give unconditionally. This is what we need. I saw it as a challenge to both left and right. I thought the right knew how to help people but didn't want to. And the left wanted to help people, but didn't know how, I would say at the time. And I think the left has improved quite a bit. And I think the right's understanding is not. So I've been interested in unconditional redistribution since I was a teenager, but I had to go through college and graduate school. But I knew while I was studying that I was gonna make writing about social justice a big focus of my life, and that one of the aspects of that social justice was going to involve unconditional redistribution of what we have.
All right. In your book, I have some notes here. I apologize.
Sure.
In your book, Economics for Social Workers, you wrote on the matter of human services. The Federation has programs such as mental health care, dental, things along those lines. There's a lot of emphasis that we want to build out and ensure that the basic needs of society are met through infrastructure, including things like healthcare. So once the necessities are taken care of, capitalism can really start to take place beyond the basic needs. What features do you think we should probably look at as forms of infrastructure that might not necessarily be traditionally assumed to be as such, because through the traditionally capitalist lens that we work in right now, this is considered such a, oh, well, that's a totally for-profit thing, that might be a bit of a invisible failure at this point, because we know where other failures of the system are right now. Are there any that your study would give you in further insight to, I guess is what I'm saying.
Well, two two of the failures of our system, I think, go together. Two or three of them go together. They're the equal and sort of the equal and opposite of each other. Is that we've created the system of private ownership of just about everything, of just about all resources on the earth. And we distributed, and it was imposed on people by violence, against their will, in order to benefit a few very privileged people. And they've never had to pay back, and never had two kinds of responsibilities. Never had a responsibility for, well, I control more of the earth than you do. What do I owe you for that? If if we want to have equality before the law, then we've either got to share the earth equally, find some way to do that, or those who have more have to provide something for those who have less. And there's no such responsibility. We always act like taxes on the wealthy are some sort of like government demand for like it's a payment for a government service. It's taxes on holding more wealth than everybody else for redistribution to have less should be considered part of the purchase price of property. Your right to hold that property is because you've done something for somebody who doesn't have property. That is a way to make ownership of the earth at least consistent with equality before the law. Now, the equal and opposite of that is that because we haven't done this, because the earth has been divided up into private property and the vast majority didn't get a share, the vast majority of us are then constantly threatened with poverty or economic destitution unless we keep working. And we have to work for the very people who control the property. By having the system where you pay for the resources that you control or that you use and you use up, but you get paid for the resources that other people control. If you have that, you end this system where the mass of us have to have no independence from the wealthy. And we don't know what a market system would be like if we had a market system where the working class entered the labor market because they wanted to, not because they had to. How that would change the world, I don't know. Now, then there's a third issue here. So not only do property owners have no responsibility to pay to those who have less property than them, but they also have virtually no environmental responsibility. The rhetoric of property ownership often talks about appropriating wastelands by mixing your labor with it, and the idea that all of the world's nature should be up for grabs to the first person who mixes their labor with it by taking a woods and making it into a farm, or taking a mountain and making it into a mine. Well, actually, those things aren't always good. We need an environment to keep us alive, and we have not really incorporated that into our economic thinking. The biggest piece of infrastructure we have is the environment, and we're not preserving it. We have little piecemeal policies here to preserve tiny bits of it. We've already destroyed most of the environment. that sustains the earth. The mass of wild animals is just and the habitat area where wild animals can live has over the last few centuries is just contracted to a tiny fraction of what it was. People need to be paying for the resources they use, and we need to be using that to create a big, healthy environment with much more habitat than we have now. And it would not be hard to do if we got rid of things like suburban sprawl and used better, more compact farming techniques and things like that.
Some of what you were just talking about is covered in a book you published called The Prehistory of Private Property. Could
Mhm.
you give a bit of the history of how we went from a non-property based society and the stages that actually occurred? Because yes, there was violence, but it seems like the assumptions of private property are so baked into, it's become this idea of natural order.
Yeah,
You hear that a lot in conservative arguments. It's just the natural order of things. This is why it's good at it's this way, is because it mirrors the natural state. And if this was a process that was imposed by oligarchs, that would be a man-made, not natural phenomena. So can you take us through that history a bit?
yeah. The story that they tell, that claiming it's a natural order, is based on no empirical data whatsoever. It's just a made up fantasy story where an individual goes into the woods, clears the land, plants crops on it, thereby mixing their labor with the land and improving it, and taking something that was basically worthless wasteland and making it into something very valuable for society by making it into a farm or a business or something like that. And then they say, this is what people naturally want to do. Everybody wants to appropriate property. Appropriating property makes us all better off, because if you go and get a job, you can make more than the original appropriator did. None of that is based on fact. This is not where the private property system comes from. That imaginary original appropriator who wants to go out and appropriate individual private property, this is not how the original farmers behaved, or the original inhabitants of any territories behaved. That's how a citizen of a trading society, of a market economy, a mercantilist or capitalist economy, that's how somebody that has an army and a police force that's already taken control over the land as a whole and has established a trading economy, they might want this, but that's not how the original people to hunt and gather and fish and farm on land did it. Most of the earth was inhabited first by nomadic hunter-gatherers who tended to share the land at least with members of their tribe. Very often various tribes share the land. You didn't have to be a member of a particular tribe to have access to land in a lot of areas. And some hunter-gatherers settled. Not all hunter-gatherers are nomadic. Fishing communities often tend to be not nomadic, and might have something a little more territorial. But when farming comes along, it doesn't come along the way this appropriation story says, with individuals going out and appropriating land. The earliest types of agriculture is Swidden agriculture, where a village of, say, several hundred people, maybe as few as 100, maybe as many as 600 people, will go out into a woods, clear the land as a community.
So what you're saying is,
farm it
so
for
what
a
you're
few years. Hold on, let me finish. Farm it for a few years, until they deplete the land, and then move to somewhere else and do the same as a community where everyone in the community is entitled to some land to farm, but not to some land to own, just land to farm for the season. It could be different land every summer, and access to the surrounding territory to hunt and gather as well. That is the way the earliest farmers behaved, as villages, not as this mythical capitalist individual. Now, what was your question?
I don't worry about it, I forgot.
Okay, and this kind of, most of the world a few thousand years ago was made up of areas where there were either nomadic hunter-gatherers, or there were these small scale sort of village agriculturalists. And I talked about Swidden agriculturalists, which means they call it slash and burn. That's when you're moving every few years. But you can get crop rotation where you don't need to move every few years. And you tend to get that, you get that in various climates and places where it works. But you also get that in response to there not being enough land that you can keep moving. But very often, places that had crop rotation and farmed the same village year after year still did not have property rights the way right-wing people say is natural. They still don't have property rights in that sense. The property rights were still very much at the village level. Sometimes you'd farm the same plot every year. Sometimes your plot would be different every year. But very often you had the right to farm a plot, but you also had the right to keep animals on some shared ground and rights to go out and hunt in the woods nearby. And how you could farm and what you could farm was something that you and the other villagers would discuss and talk about. Now, very often there'd be a parasitic chief or a lord put on top of this, and sometimes those people would get pretty powerful and oppressive, but very often not so much. Very often these parasitic layers took a few taxes, and people got to run their lives pretty much the way they wanted themselves. This is what property looked like in most parts of the world. It was not this private property system. It was neither communism. It was neither communism nor capitalism nor mercantilism. It was its own thing. Village agriculture. My co-author and I call it, but there's no real name for it. And then colonialists started taking this away. This begins thousands of years ago, but it progresses very slowly until about 500 or 600 years ago. The people who tell these stories about how private property is supposed to be natural will say that, well, if you got a hunter-gatherer who becomes a farmer, he needs less land to live on, so he's essentially making more land available for the other hunter-gatherers than if he didn't farm. Well, I suppose in theory, if you ignore population growth, that sounds plausible. But there is no time in the history of the world where you witness farmers giving away land to hunter-gatherers. It doesn't happen. What happens is, when you get larger scale farming, such as you get, I'll say along the Nile and the Tigris and Euphrates, when you get larger scale farming, you tend to get a rapid increase in population. And these people get really hungry for land, and they become aggressive, and they go out and they have colonialism over the village, the small scale village agriculturalists or the hunters and gatherers, and they attack them and establish empires, or they simply establish a government over what remains village agriculture. In Europe, in say the year 1400, there was still a lot of this village agriculture going on. They had a private property system or something like it had developed in the cities, but most of the countryside was still the same old village agriculture that variations of it existed for thousands of years. Then you begin to get the enclosure movement, where the lords of the manor decide that I am and have always been the owner, and these peasants who have farmed and worked this land for thousands of years are mere tenants. I have rights over the land, the tenants have customs and tradition that really aren't very valuable. So I can change all the rules of how the land is used. I can consider them tenants. I can kick them off if I don't want to renew their lease. I can make them my employees, or I can make them go to the city and they can try to get a job there. And this process is a slow process that went around Europe beginning, say, in the 1400s and being largely complete by the 1800s in most areas. But in places like Russia, it really wasn't complete until the Soviets took over and essentially did very similar things to what the enclosure movement was in Western Europe, giving a politically powerful insider control over the land and the people on it. They did it in the name of collectivization. But it was really the same sort of process. And this is what creates the private property system that we know of. And this is happening at about the same time that these early libertarians were writing about how natural it is to go out and appropriate property when no one was doing this. That's happening in Europe at the same time also that colonialism is spreading this system around the world. The Europeans are going and taking over a bunch of countries and establishing private property systems in various countries around the world, often to people who are practicing some variation on village agriculture or some variation on hunting and gathering cultures. There's also some big cities they're taking over that'll have something else entirely, but imposing this Western notion of private property where the owner has full dominion over the land. They don't know anyone to everybody else for getting a larger share of the earth than the 99% of humanity got. They don't know anything back for that. And we established this over pretty much the entire earth. And we've got to the point where people think it's completely natural, that this is just the way things are. And this is not just the way things are. This is just the way things have been forced on us.
You talk about the enclosure process in like this very past tense kind of sense. It almost seems like that there's a continuation of this process. You can correct me if I'm wrong, where within the modern economy, more rural economies are being strangled to move people into the city, that the land can be bought at low cost in often distress sales, so on and so forth, encouraging the young to move away from the more rural areas, that the land can be purchased by larger immortal entities called corporations that are owned that way. Wouldn't that be almost an extension of the enclosure process? Is that the removal of the tenants from the land, only it's being done through the acquisition, through the estate tax acquisition, through depriving those communities of vital living wages and the ability for people to stay there? I mean, has that process really ended in the greater scheme of things?
Oh yeah. When you put it that way, yeah, there's still things like this going on. The more and more of our resources are being privatized all the time. The broadcast spectrum, governments have just given that away to corporations, this hugely valuable thing that they could rent out for billions of dollars a year. They just give it away to corporations. That is something that was common property of us all, now being the property of a few, and they sell it back to us. And they don't just get the profit from what they add to it. They get the profit from the value that they own this piece of the broadcast spectrum that nobody else owns. They get the profit from that. And you get a transformation of family farmers into people who are essentially tenant farmers of corporations, where they have these arrangements with corporations where they raise things directly for them, and it's a way for these national agricultural corporations to get the individual farmer to take a lot of risk, but also to that the corporation can control the process and control what is produced and get while giving the least paid, still continuing to happen. Every smokestack that puts out pollutions is privatizing the commons, making it the private sinkhole of whoever's polluting it. The dead zones at the bottom of our at the mouth of almost every river in the world, as fertilizers and pollutants go downstream and create an area in the ocean where things can't live. That is privatizing the oceans, and in the worst possible way, just making what was a thriving environment into a wasteland.
So within your writings, you write about the differences between a voluntary economy and a mandatory economy.
Voluntary participation economy and a mandatory participation economy.
Yeah. Can you describe the ethical differences, the structural differences, and why you feel it important that we engage in exploring ways to accomplish a UBI? And that, I don't want to make the argument for you. So go ahead.
Yeah, well, connecting what I was just saying, one of the reasons I talk about the enclosure movement and the colonial movement as being complete is, even though that more resources from the commons are being privatized in different ways all the time, and power is being redirected from individuals, from middle and lower class individuals to wealthy corporations. Power is being redistributed up all the time. So in that sense, it's not complete, but it is complete in the sense that we've essentially created a mandatory participation economy. So many of the resources have been privatized that people cannot simply work for themselves. People have to work for somebody who owns resources. You can say, well, I could start my own business. Well, that's not, starting your own business is not the same as not working. It's not the same as being independently wealthy. Independently wealthy people don't work for others. People who start their own business work for their landlord. They work for their bank. They work for their clients. And all of those people have to have money. You cannot have a business that doesn't have a place to be a business. So you've got to rent that land from somebody. If you don't have land, you have to rent it from somebody who owns land. You've got to rent your house. You've got to rent or buy your house. You've got to rent or buy someplace to have your business. That means you're going to be working for landlords and banks for a very large portion of your life, not to mention your clients, who have to be people with money too. You start a business that only serves the homeless and the poor, that business is not going to make money, and you're not going to be able to buy a house or a place to have your business. So this is what I mean by a mandatory participation economy. And the world does not have to be a mandatory participation economy, and it wasn't. For most of the time humans were on this planet, you could go and hunt and gather and fish and farm for yourself as you wished. You did not have to work for someone else. You did not have to take someone's orders. You did not have to be in a subordinate position. We've created this system where all of those opportunities to work only for yourself have been taken away from you. And you must join this hierarchy that we call the economy. You must participate in that economy. That's what I call mandatory participation, is that you can't work for yourself. You must work for the hierarchy that we've created by the type of property system we have. And it is not inherent to a private property system. The Soviets, the Maoists, they didn't have a private property system, but they had a mandatory participation system. Whereas, but a lot of agricultural communities, a lot of agrarian communities, a lot of hunter-gatherer communities had voluntary participation, where if you wanted to just work for yourself, you could work for yourself. You didn't have to work for any hierarchy. So now what I think needs to be done is, if we want to have a property system, we need to compensate people for the fact that we took the environment and gave it to a few. And we need to compensate them enough to preserve their independence, to preserve voluntary participation, that they do not have to join this hierarchical labor market we have if they don't want to. If they can, if they want, somebody makes them a good offer for a good job, take it. But we're going to establish a basic income so that if none of the jobs are any good, you can still have a roof over your head, nutritious food to eat, and enough to produce some projects on your own. So to make life meaning for you, so you can find meaning in your life yourself. This is what I mean by a voluntary participation economy. And if we had this economy, the incentive for businesses to pay good wages, to offer good working conditions, to give give promotion and moving up opportunities would be so much better. We'd have so much more of a kinder and a more humane economy if we establish a voluntary participation economy and put genuine power in the hands of the 99%.
I've heard the argument said that if we remove the fear from the economy, people won't work. I find that a dubious position, but that's just anecdotal. Within your work, have you found anything that either supports or undermines that position?
The people they so greatly exaggerate. No one will work. Well, would you quit your job for a $20,000 a year basic income? Do you think LeBron James is going to quit his job for that? You give a person a good job that where they're rewarded, where they're appreciated, then you want to work. If the responsibility for getting someone to work belongs to employers. If you don't want to pay somebody enough that they will voluntarily choose to work for you when they can't, maybe your job isn't worth doing. If people will work, everyone has their price. People will work if you make it worth their while. And it's up to you, to be an employer, is to say, I've got a job that I want done and I don't want to do it myself. Okay, well, then make it worth that person's while so they will voluntarily choose it. Don't take all the resources of the earth and say to that person, well, you're going to be homeless and starving until you do what I say. That is not free trade. Free trade is when everyone is free not to trade. And you don't have that until you establish a voluntary participation economy with UBI or something like it.
So effectively, you can't have a free market without free workers.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see. So within the structure of you've talked a lot about the importance of democratic systems in some of the things that I've watched. Within the Federation, we're putting in place a democratic governance.
Mhm.
And one of the features that means a lot to us are things along lines of ranked choice voting to prevent,
Yeah.
the powers of parties to start dividing people up
Mhm.
and embracing wedge issues to get them to focus more on solving the actual problems that need to be solved within the Federation. What features do you think would be important to include in any system that you want to have as just an economy as possible? So, for example, if you were to roll things back a few hundred or a couple thousand years and say, uh, no, we have the technology to do this reasonably, peacefully, and equitably now that weren't available 2000 years ago. So if we were to do this, how would we do this to ensure that people are not left out?
Yeah. Um, well, it would definitely the fast growing high population density communities have to be would have had to been a lot less aggressive, have slower population growth, and more voluntary more voluntary interaction with the with the low population density communities that don't necessarily want to be a part of this big growing global economy. But you need to put in place things that balance. If you're going to have a world where a bunch of people or a few people control most of the land's resources, most of the Earth's resources, as I said, they've got to pay back to the people who therefore control less of the Earth's resources. That is one key feature, but also we got to think about how many of the Earth's resources do we want to privatize? We have privatized far too many of them already. Our nature areas are far too small to sustain the environment that we live in. We've done too much of privatizing the water system and the atmosphere in the form of pollution. We need to think about things as terms of privatization. How many resources do we privatize, and on what terms do we privatize them? Just because you own, we've designated that if you pay this tax, that will give you the right to own this land by the river. That doesn't mean you can dump any crap you want into that river. And it doesn't mean that you can take out as much water as you want from that river. We've got to decide how to balance that with the other with other concerns. So we need an economy where we think of the environment and our resource base as the people's endowment. And the idea is to maximize the true value, not just the financial value of our endowment. The financial value is part of it, making part of it into a market economy where we can have growth and trade, making part of it into that is fine, but also making sure we do that in a way that's environmentally sustainable, that's going to involve having really large areas to keep a thriving environment and to have strong pollution controls, and making people pay for every piece of pollution they put into the air and jacking that price up to greatly discourage it. Those are the kind of things we need to do. And these things need to be thought of as a negotiation. Everybody wants to use the earth differently, but none of us has any special rights to it. We all appeared here. We were all born here. Wasn't anybody's choice. Nobody has greater claim to this earth than anybody else. So, and we got these competing ideas about how to use it. So we got to negotiate this stuff and think about it in a way that's going to make it good. That's going to make it good for everybody for a long time into the future, well, permanently.
So what do you think would be the best way for me to ensure that we create a system that is both just but specifically accountable in your mind, and to whom what mechanisms of transparency do you think lack in today's economy? Because it seems like so much of the politics of today is two groups debating over simplified economics as politics, but the simplified economics seems to omit certain inconvenient facts for that side of the argument. And they're so busy yelling at each other, repeating the same narratives that have been going for the last 40 years, no one's actually acknowledging the addressing the concerns, because they're just counting on the other side to suck more than they do versus actually addressing their own concerns. Is there any uh beyond ranked choice voting, what do you think should be done perhaps to avoid these more tribalist impulses that allow people to distill arguments down to something that, well, I'm just going to make my argument and not even address the vulnerabilities of my own, only attacking the vulnerability of someone else's?
Yeah. Well, um, there, the electoral reforms we need uh, are incredible. One thing is probably the biggest thing, more than the electoral stuff of how we run our elections, whether we should have ranked choice voting, is get the money out of politics. Paying federal officials is not speech, it's bribery. And you cannot have a democracy where people who have money get to buy politicians. We've legalized bribery in the form of campaign contributions that we don't even think of it as bribery. Or as corruption. All these politicians who spend most of their time every day raising money do not think of that as corruption. That is exactly what it is. The government is responsive to what the wealthy donors want and not to what the mass of humans want. That is not democracy. That is the biggest and most important thing. Now, after that, even if you got rid of that, we'd have all kinds of problems, and which need to be solved. And others, the kind of system we have with a Congress rather than a parliament, a single elected president, and what we call first past the post voting, which isn't very descriptive of what it actually is, but whoever gets the most votes in the first round, even if they get far less than a majority, if they only get if there's 3 people running, you could have somebody with 34% of the vote being elected. When you and if you have 10 people running, you could have somebody with 11% of the vote being elected. When you have that sort of a system, it pays everyone to vote for the lesser of two evils. We do not have the people voting for the lesser of two evils because voters are stupid. It's not because voters are making a mistake. Third parties always treat it as if voters are making a mistake. Oh, all you have to do is vote third party and that'll change everything. It will change nothing. The system is set up, not necessarily intentionally, but it's set up in a way that pushes third parties out. There have only been 4 or 5 elections in presidential elections in U.S. history where there've been more than 2 viable candidates. The election of 1860, the last one was 1912, and that was only because Theodore Roosevelt, a former president, was running on a third party ticket. And then you got to go to a few more before the Civil War, and that's it. The system we have creates a 2-party system, which creates all kinds of problems. We need ranked choice voting is one thing, proportional representation is another, and democracy by lot is another one, where you have a body of people that is selected at random from the people as a whole. And we need to experiment with these kind of things. We need to experiment with these kind of things. It'd be really interesting to try having three houses of the legislature, one of say 1,000 members each. One is selected with ranked choice voting, the other is selected with proportional representation, and the other is selected at random. That would create a much more deliberative system than we have. But that's not. But any mix of these can be good. What is one of the things that's most lacking in not just our system, but the system around the world, is experimenting with electoral systems. If we really want to have democracy, we should be trying, well, what are the different rules that we could have that we know what we want is rule of the people. What are the different decision-making processes that we could experiment with to try to do better in order to get something that is truly truly the rule of the people? And we're so far from it right now. We need to try massive different things. We have 50 different states that could all be experimenting with different democratic experiments, but they all have this set constitution that's really hard to change. And most of it is set in a way that privileges privileges wealthy people and entrenched privilege to begin with. So it's hard to change it in a way that moves it towards true democracy.
With your work, I mean, there's a lot of debate between capitalism, socialism, communism. Where do you see yourself fitting into the overall spectrum of economic discourse, or is it, or do you just say, you know what, I prefer to be completely removed from that, from a work standpoint?
Yeah, I think the concept of there being a continuum from capitalism on one end to socialism or communism on the other end is just false and misleading. There is no ideal capitalism, there is no ideal socialism, and there are so many different policies, so many different ways we could arrange the economy, that it's not a continuum, a one-dimensional continuum, nor is it a two-dimensional spectrum, but it's a many, many, many multiple dimensional spectrum of different policies we could have in different ways. For most of human history, the words capitalism and communism did not exist. In 1800, the word capitalism was not coined, and socialism was just barely coming into use, and it didn't mean what it means today, or the 10 different things it means today. So for most of history, this idea of there being these two alternatives did not exist. By 1900, it was looked at like there are only two alternatives. Well, actually, if you look at history, if you look at anthropology, there are hugely many different ways people have organized their economies. Every single change we make makes a different economy. So no, I don't think of myself as being on some spectrum between capitalism and socialism. It's just what policies are going to work to help humanity, and that's going to be, I'm sure that's going to use some markets, but it's also going to involve negotiation, common ownership of some resources, public ownership of other resources, private ownership of some resources, but with people who obey regulations and pay their taxes. You're going to have some mix of these things, but that's going to change. Exactly what mix you're going to have is going to change with the changing needs of our society and what we need to make an environment, both an economic environment and a natural environment that's going to work for people.
I would almost argue that the definition of capitalism, the definition of socialism and communism is almost a definition in search of meaning, because when you hear two people debate, they're going off of their definition of the other person's beliefs and attacking that versus what the person actually believes, or even why they believe it. They ascribe beliefs to the other person, they ascribe motivations to the other person, but they haven't actually heard a single word either side has said.
Yeah, very often. Yeah, so that means when you have a capitalist debating with a socialist, you're dealing with four definitions. You got your capitalist definition of capitalism and your capitalist definition of socialism, your socialist definition of socialism, your socialist definition of capitalism, and they're all completely different. And that's also not going to be, it's not going to be the same. You get a different capitalist and a different socialist, and those definitions are going to change again. So yeah, the debate between capitalism and socialism is the debate between vagueness and vagueness. There's just, you cannot sum up an economic system in single words like that. The world is just too complex.
Oh, that's one of the reasons why I dislike Twitter, is that all this political discourse takes place over Twitter. It's basically, hey, let's run our country based off of bumper stickers.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I have never actually had, I've never had an interesting conversation with someone about politics that consisted of slogans. And I know there are people in my life who have avoided talking politics with me specifically because they know that they're probably going to just get a 3-hour lecture on the economics of why it works that way. And they're just going to be like, but I can't tweet that, is kind of the response. And do you think there's something that could be done to actually create more or encourage more robust conversation that we have so much discussion of, well, people want to be a out of the box thinker or not be a sheep or do this or so and so forth, depending on what side of the aisle you're talking about. One side says out of the box, the other side says don't be a sheep, but both of them are effectively saying don't simply follow the person in front of you or follow the slogan that you've been given, but both of them are operating based off of slogans in this limited conversation. How do you actually say, okay, how would you structure something to say, let's move past the slogans and actually start having these conversations so people have the option not to simply follow the herd? Because when you limit the conversation to such small conversations, it never goes anywhere.
Yeah. I know that social media is, the way it's organized now, is bad for our mental health and bad for politics. And I say this despite the fact that I use social media. I use Facebook and Twitter. I get my messages out on these platforms because I know of no other way. But so I know that's part of the problem. But part of the problem is also in our political structure. If we had a political structure that was based on things like proportional representation, ranked choice voting, democracy by lot, and it wasn't dominated by these two parties, I think we'd have a more open structure. Also, our regulation of news media has been really terrible and created this polarized news media system. If we went back to the regulations we had in the 1970s, that would probably cure a lot of this. So I know that social media has to change, but I don't know how it needs to change to make it. And some of its problems are not necessarily about politics, but also about that we know that corporations who run these social media things are trying to addict us to social media. They're doing it they're trying to manipulate us in ways that are good for them and bad for the users, and we're just letting them do it. That's got to change. That's got to change. We need a situation where social media is set up for the benefit of the user, not for the benefit of the owner to manipulate the user. And I think there are ways to do that. It have to do with governance. Back in the mid 20th century, when we had a very different sort of capitalism than we have now, people talked a lot about worker ownership, that corporations should be owned by workers because they have so much power over the workers. And that might be true for some corporations now, and it was probably true for a lot of corporations then. But now I think for a lot of corporations today, it's really not so important to have worker ownership. But what we need is user ownership. I think any social media company should be owned 51% by the people who use it. That by using it, you become an owner of this corporation. And by them having a majority stake, then they can dictate that this is what we want. We, the users, want out of social media, and we're not going to let ourselves just be manipulated for the benefit of the owner of the corporation and the advertisers that work with them.
How do you think the best way to actually, within the context of our organization itself, is there something that you wish was done to actually regulate that as a actual mechanism? Or is that just more of a broad belief that we should do this, but you don't have any particular specific means in mind?
No, a lot of this I haven't studied. I've only read a bit about what social media is doing both to our politics and to our mental health. I only read a bit about it. So I don't know the solutions or really even how bad it is. There are people who know a lot more about that. Exactly what reforms we need, I don't know. I know that we need big reforms to the system, to the political systems, to get the money out, and to make it so it's not naturally dominated by two parties. But exactly how to do that, exactly what is the best way to do that, is not something I've studied. It's something you'll get to other people who have studied, and I know people who studied democracy by lot. I think there's a lot of promise there, and I know people who've studied ranked choice voting. There's a lot of promise there, but we need to be ready to experiment and to change. Oh, and you asked about what your organization can do. I know even less about your type of organization, because the stuff that I've written, almost all of the stuff that I've written about basic income and about reform to our distributive system, is about the people doing it through the government, through legislation, changing the laws, changing the rules. Now you're building a private institution in order to try to do this stuff, doing an end around the government. That I've studied even less. So whether it will work or not, I don't know. How it will work, I know even less. You know, so I wish you good luck, and I'll be following it to see how it comes out. But I really have no idea what works and what doesn't in the kind of strategy you're using it. But I do know that we need people trying all kinds of different strategies. People working within government, inside of government, outside of government, in private settings, and so forth.
Are there any independent organizations who would be able to lend insight into balancing the interest between the labor groups, the unions, the tribal groups who or hopefully elect the executive committee, and the general population? What you're referring to is like with social media, where people who use it in participating areas get to elect the auditors group. In terms of balancing the various privacy interests and so on and so forth, are there organizations within the UBI community that you think would be good to talk to, who might have given concerns like this thought? So I'm not necessarily just trying to, I think this might be a problem, or pull any particular solutions. I'm not looking to redouble work. I'm looking to focus more on addressing the climate crisis, not reinvent the wheel.
Right. And where do you live?
Portland, Oregon.
Okay. Are you familiar with the Big Conference? It used to be called the U.S. Big Conference, then it was called the North American Big Conference. Now it's just called the Big Conference.
It sounds vaguely familiar, but my memory is works better in terms of concepts than specific words and names and stuff like that.
Well,
it was a huge problem in school.
Because the Big Conference is going to take place in Chicago on June 8th, 9th, and 10th, or 7th, 8th, and 9th, something like that. So if you're able to get to Chicago, it's a long way from Portland, but if you're able to get to Chicago for this, it'd be good to go there and ask around. I don't know specifically anybody who's working on this. I do occasionally run into people who are like trying to start a cryptocurrency that is tied to a basic income. I'm not sure that any of those schemes have gotten off the ground in a major way yet. I don't know how well they'll work, but there's those people are trying to do an end around the government. So, I certainly support the experimentation. There is something, what's it called? A world basic income based in Manchester that's trying to create like a privately financed basic income. Give Directly, this enormous American-based charity, is running basic income trials around the world, especially in Kenya, where they have I think 10 or 15,000 people getting a small basic income thanks to private donations. So there are lots of different groups doing this in different ways, but I'm not closely tied to a lot of them. So I would suggest going to things like the US Big Conference and meeting the people and find out who's doing stuff that's similar.
All right, great. Thank you.
If you can't get to Chicago, I think there is an online portion of the conference. And also the Basic Income Earth Network will have its conference in Seoul, Seoul, Korea in August. And they will have a big online section. If you want to go to that, you'll probably find some kindred spirits there.
That would be nice. I don't want to take too much of your time. Do you have any questions? I know you have a book coming up in 2024. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, that is, it's called Universal Basic Income, and it is for MIT Press's Essential Knowledge series. They came to me and said, we want somebody to write a book on the essential knowledge about basic income. And I said, great, yeah, I'm your guy, because I've been studying this since the 20th century, but it turned out to be a lot harder than I thought, because if you've been studying something for, I've been studying in a major way for 25 years and in a minor way for 40 years. When you know that, when you've studied something for that long, to go back and think, what are the essentials? What are the 40,000 words that I wouldn't want somebody who's completely new to basic income? What are the most important things for them to get? That was really hard. It was really hard to do that. But after years of working on this, I've got that 45,000 word book. It's undergoing typesetting and proofreading and stuff like that with the publisher right now, and it'll be out in February. It's going to cover what is basic income, how does it differ from more traditional social policies, how much does it cost, how can we finance it, what are the arguments for and against it, what's the evidence of how it's likely to work, how it's likely to help people, and what's the future of the movement for basic income. I'm really proud of this book. It's going to be out in February, and I hope interested people pick it up.
Well, I definitely will. But if you would like to come back onto the channel when you launch that video or launch that book, it'd be great to have you back.
Oh, sounds great.
To hear more specific about what you've written.
Sounds great.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Doctor. Unless you have any other questions, I should probably let you go soon.
No. All right. Yeah. Great talking to you. And yeah, let's do that. Maybe the book has, I think, what, 6 or 7 chapters. You might have like one question on each chapter or something might work. So.
All right. Great. Thank you.
Yeah.